Howdy Internet, my name is Joseph Che, and today I'm going to read to you my essay on the character assassination of Luke Skywalker and other major issues with The Last Jedi. Just a little background here, I'm 30 years old, huge Star Wars fan. As far back as I can remember, the original trilogy was in my life. It was my mythology, my center, my playground, my escape. I played the games, Super Star Wars, Rogue Squadron, Shadows of the Empire, Episode 1 Racer. Read some of the Young Jedi books, prequels came out when I was in my early teens. Not the best movies, I think most would agree. Cheers to that, but there was definitely a lot of wasted potential there, but I never let them ruin the original trilogy for me, and they didn't actively try to do that. So, the Disney sale happened, and I was a bit wary, but happy that the franchise would continue on. I kind of liked The Force Awakens. It was kind of a necessary evil to get the franchise back on track, so I had expectations that afterwards they were gonna, they had gotten their ball rolling and maybe they might get their stuff together. I just wish it had respected the original characters more. I understand that Harrison Ford wanted to retire, but they still could have done a much better job with his death scene. And I felt like I really wanted a little more background on what was happening and why we're sort of seeing a repeat of the events that had already, to my mind, been concluded in the original trilogy. Other than that, it was entertaining. It was an entertaining film. I really expected that we were going to get some explanation for why Rey was so powerful. Of course, we never got any of that. But Rogue One wasn't perfect, but I enjoyed it a lot as a standalone film. So, I saw The Last Jedi on its Thursday night premiere. And on the hour-and-a-half long drive back home, I was absolutely enraged and dumbfounded by what I had just seen. I quickly put my thoughts into words, and I wrote about 85, maybe 90% of this essay that weekend. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into Campbell or the monomyth. I am mostly focusing on shortcomings in storytelling and character development in The Last Jedi. Defenders of this film may say that it's a deconstruction of Star Wars, when in reality, I think it's more of a desecration of Star Wars, point by point, a subversion of Star Wars. And in terms of pacing, tone, character moments and all that, it doesn't even feel like a Star Wars film. Like, for real, take out the John Williams score and the art, and this isn't even gonna, resemble a Star Wars film at all. This whole movie was a bunch of boring explanations, pointless heavy-handed conflicts, technobabble, preachy subplots, and dumb jokes. It's telling, not showing things, and it reads like the first draft of a fan fiction, which isn't surprising, since it bears what some would say are more than coincidental resemblances to a popular fanfiction called Interstellar Transmissions, which was released into the wild a month after The Force Awakens. There's actually a whole article on The Atlantic about that doozy. So, without further ado, let's get into it. On the character assassination of Luke Skywalker and other major issues with The Last Jedi. In this essay, I will show that The Last Jedi is not just an incompetently made film. It's a stain on the legacy of Star Wars, and a direct assault on the core fanbase, especially those who grew up on the original trilogy. With a single exception, I will be using only the films themselves to make my points. Obviously, there will be massive spoilers for The Last Jedi ahead. This film is a big middle finger to anyone who grew up believing in Luke Skywalker. Without any good reason, it completely destroys his established character and turns him into a terrified and cowardly old man, committed to dying alone, wallowing in regret. By strongly contrasting Luke with a saintly Rey, and presenting her as a flawless paragon of moral perfection, the film not only makes her a distant character who's hard to relate to, it also belittles the struggles of Luke and Anakin and all of their allies, and retroactively subverts the hopes and overall message of the original trilogy. In the book, Anime, From Akira to Howl's Moving Castle, author Susan J. Napier tells the story of a young girl in Japan who wrote to Hayao Miyazaki with a small complaint. She couldn't relate to the heroes of his films because they were too strong and perfect, and thus distant. That unattainable ideal is honestly what Rey represents, an impossible character, whose only inner conflict, and I'm being generous with the word conflict here, is that she doesn't know who her parents are. Over the course of 2 films, she has never suffered a great, life-changing loss or had to face any real moral dilemma. In fact, her personal development has been rushed as all hell because, at the end of The Force Awakens, it's only been a couple of days since she encountered Finn and got caught up in the war. The only window for time to have passed occurs during the period after the destruction of Starkiller Base, but before Rey leaves to seek out Luke. Even so, we're not looking at a significant amount of time. In all 6 of the pre-Disney films, Star Wars protagonists undergo years-long inner journeys that change and shape their characters, leading to choices that drive the narrative. These heroes' growth through various challenges based upon the Joseph Campbell hero's journey template that Star Wars greatly popularized, shaped their inner evolution while simultaneously driving the narratives of their respective films. Before we get into The Last Jedi at all, let's first investigate why this model of gradual character growth is so essential to telling a story in the idiom of the Campbellian mythos. The hero's journeys of Anakin and Luke Skywalker. Anakin was introduced as a talented young boy with a great hand for machines, pride in his skills, a lot of ambition, and, of course, strength in the Force. These traits are presented as mostly beneficial to his work as a slave boy for Watto and his career as a pod racer. But via the first Jedi Temple scene, we see that Anakin's future is clouded and uncertain, and there is fear in him. There's also a deleted scene in The Phantom Menace where Anakin beats the tar out of Greedo, who is evidently bullying him. Between that scene being cut and Anakin's tough kid trash talk with Sebulba, we get a sense that Mr. Lucas wanted to drop only subtle hints of Anakin's darker side this early on. In Attack of the Clones, the first things we notice about Anakin are that he's anxious, reckless, impulsive, petulant, and thirsty for Padmé's affection. By this point, Anakin spent many years in training and is ready for some action in every sense of the word. He also undergoes a major challenge when he senses that his mother is in peril. His response? To slay the Sand People in anger. His scene of admission to Padmé shows how torn he is, not because of his remorse, but because he had none, as evidenced by the line, "They were animals, and I slaughtered them like animals." And of course, in Revenge of the Sith, Anakin was torn between his political friendship with Sheev Palpatine and the Jedi Order, but he did not take a holistic view of the matter and allowed his judgment to be led by Palpatine, who preyed on his fears. Through his powerful position, Palpatine also gave Anakin the kind of lovin' he couldn't get from either the Jedi or Padmé. He stroked Anakin's ego, drip-fed him with praise, fanned the fires of his ambitions, and finally told him what he already knew, that he was stronger than the Jedi, and their dogmatic ways were holding him back. Everything that informed Anakin's turn to the dark side was a question of nurture over nature. He was a sweet kid starting out, but he was presented with obstacles and given choices. Some of his choices may have been either bad or good depending on your point of view, but the ones that led him towards the dark side were clearly defined. He slew the Sand People, he slew an unarmed Count Dooku, he let his fear of Padmé dying, a strong premonition, nothing more, influence his actions to turn against Mace Windu and support Darth Sidious's murderous plot. He killed children, he murdered the Separatist leadership, finally he choked his own wife. When he awakens in the Darth Vader suit after a torturous process, the first thing little Annie asks is whether Padmé is alive. His grief and anguish over learning that she died drives him over the edge in sorrow. The aftermath of Revenge of the Sith paints a very clear picture of what kind of man the imposing villain of the original trilogy really was. Vader was not born innately evil, nor a misunderstood hero. He's a tragic figure who made some very bad choices and became essentially spiritually trapped in a cyborg body. Doing the bidding of the master, he was cleverly manipulated into serving. And despite better robotics existing, see General Grievous, Darth Sidious kept Vader in a suit that was painful, awkward, and limiting, so as to keep his power and spirit forever in check. Now, that's a mythological story if I ever heard one. It's Faustian, epic, allegorical, and larger than life. Now, off to Luke Skywalker's story, which we'll explore in slightly greater detail because of the multitude of choices he makes and the path that he takes. In Star Wars A New Hope, Luke was a budding pilot yearning for adventure and to escape the life of a moisture farmer. He was ready to join the Empire if he had to in order to realize his ambitions. Then things happen, and his aunt and uncle are killed. This is the major turning point for Luke. He never thought his desire for adventure would manifest itself in this way. Now he had nowhere to go, and was caught up in something much larger than himself. Enraptured by tales of the Jedi Knights and the needs of the pretty princess, Luke chooses to accompany Obi-Wan, and makes the effort to pull his weight. He presses Han to make sure they're not being gypped. He actively decides to train in the Force, finds training with the droid difficult, and yet continues on. Luke uses his wits and skills to make it off the Death Star, makes a choice to join the rebellion, attempts to convince Han to fight with them, and turns off his targeting computer so that he can put his faith in the Force to guide his hand. Now, with regards to the destruction of the first Death Star, the Force in this instance acts as the Tao, or Key, or Holy Spirit, if you will. Essentially, we're talking about the energy of the universe. This is the most important moment in all of Star Wars. Ultimately, the universe decides to help guide Luke's hand to take out the Death Star. Even as he celebrates with his friends, Luke knows deep down that he owes his success to the power of the Force, not to his own ego. He avoids the trap that Anakin fell in. Luke's father constantly hogged the spotlight, took credit for every action that went in his favor, and bragged about saving Obi-Wan, except for that one time post-rescue in Revenge of the Sith, when he defers to Obi-Wan in order to one-up him with put-on modesty. Furthermore, in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke is visited by Obi-Wan's Force Ghost, who tells him to seek out Yoda to continue his training. Luke doesn't want to leave his friends, but he realizes that he must do his best to become stronger to face Vader. So he reluctantly leaves. On Dagobah, he must confront his weaknesses. Luke is patient and impulsive. Yoda taunts him by being mischievous and misleading. Then he reveals that his silly alien act was just a front, and Luke immediately insists that he won't fail Yoda. The training that Yoda prescribes for Luke is specifically tailored to address his weaknesses, which are, namely, his lack of patience and his impulsiveness. And sure enough, it's this impatience, coupled with his attachment towards his friends, that spurs Luke into action. Even knowing full well that he might be walking into a trap, Luke can't ignore his friend's suffering. The difference between his reaction to this premonition and Anakin's in Attack of the Clones is that Luke is acting out of genuine love and concern from feeling the certainty of his friend's suffering, not from fear caused by a dream, one likely incepted into him by Sheev. Please keep in mind that the ideas of premonition, dreams, and even strong feelings about the present being taken seriously are storytelling tools often used in mythology. Luke's rush into action leads to immediate negative consequences for himself, but the aftermath spurs on a lot of inner growth and soul-searching. It was utterly important for Luke to learn A, the truth of his parentage, B, that he was not yet Vader's equal in combat, and C, that he should have listened to his masters. Luke takes these lessons to heart, and when we see him again in Return of the Jedi, he's had time to grow and to train. Luke surprises us with his aptitude and skills and saves the day. Then, before the Endor mission, Luke shows the depths of his sensitivity to the Force when he senses that Vader is on the nearby ship. Luke then confronts his father in full acceptance of the truth of his own parentage and insists that he can be redeemed. This is a bold move from Luke, and he suffers a lot at the hands of the Emperor because of it. He's put to the ultimate test as he's been shown that his friends on the Forest Moon and in the Rebel fleet are all doomed. Yet, Luke continues to have faith in the Force and in his father. Luke's belief in the innate good of the human heart to triumph over evil wakes up the good in Anakin Skywalker, the part of him that screamed, "What have I done?" after letting Mace Windu die to Force lightning in a similar manner. And Anakin throws the Emperor off the balcony. The end of the arcs of both of these characters takes place after Anakin asks Luke to take his mask off, revealing Sebastian Shaw's pale baby face, now at peace. Anakin implores Luke to tell his sister that he was right about him. After nearly 2 decades of murderous acts, Anakin has brought balance to the Force, but it's only through opening himself to the spark of love and understanding that Luke had awoken in him by suffering for his father's sake. This act of unconditional love towards a mass murderer echoed Anakin's own sacrifice, reminding him in just the right moment why he sold his soul to Darth Sidious in the first place. It was to save his wife and children. And this snaps him out of the dark side. The journeys that these characters go on are compelling in and of themselves, but together they form the skeleton that holds the first 6 Star Wars films together. Say what you will about the subplots in the prequels. Anakin's and Luke's lives inform one another and intersect, and the father-son redemption arc is airtight. We saw much of Anakin's difficult childhood and how it shaped him, and we can imagine what Luke's childhood was like, from the characterizations of his aunt and uncle, in Attack of the Clones and A New Hope. A complete story has been told. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's move on to the new films and how they handled the journey of Rey. Rey's non-hero's journey. Rey is the anti-Star Wars hero. She finds herself suddenly innately and unimaginably powerful for no good reason, with the only vague explanation in the films being a throwaway line by Snoke about how Kylo Ren's sudden rise in power left a vacuum on the light side of the Force that needed to be filled. Rey does things considered to be impossible, knows things she shouldn't, and is able to do great feats with her power without any negative consequences, ever arising from her inability to control or predict said power. She has been correctly identified as the epitome of the Mary Sue trope, that is, a character that is perfect in every way, solves every problem, and always steps up to the plate to deal with any situation. Rey overshadows everyone else in the galaxy by virtue of having no character flaws and being proficient in literally everything she does. In The Force Awakens, she can pull off a perfect Immelman turn, which is the most difficult aerial maneuver, with the Millennium Falcon, despite never having flown it in her life. She also surprises Han by fixing the Millennium Falcon in a way that he had never even considered. She also uses a Jedi mind trick without prior instruction. Upon using a lightsaber for the first time in her life, Rey defeats an immensely powerful, trained Force user who slaughtered a temple full of Jedi trainees. An argument can be made that Kylo Ren's shaken mental state after killing his father caused his mind to be clouded, but the hateful act of murder is supposed to empower dark-side adepts, which is why Anakin was able to slay all the younglings after assisting in Mace Windu's murder. It is also true that Kylo was shot by Chewie's bowcaster and perhaps a bit weakened, but Rey's proficiency in saber combat still comes out of left field. Many fans anticipated that there would be a reveal, explaining that Rey had also been a student of the Force, and had just lost her memory, or had her memory wiped, or been left on Jakku for her own protection. We got no such thing. In The Last Jedi, it is shown that Rey has an innate understanding of how to wield and use a lightsaber. No training required, folks. Over the course of a few days to a week at most, she goes from having no knowledge of the Force to besting Luke Skywalker in single combat, to expertly taking out the Praetorian Guards, to being able to lift what I presume to be several tons of boulders with the Force. All of this is patently ridiculous. For comparison's sake, why don't we contrast Luke's years of training with Rey's innate knowledge of the Force? He struggles against the training droid, while she instinctively takes to the lightsaber. That said, the fact that her parents are nobodies, unless we later discover that she was literally born from the Force and Kylo was lying, and there is no prophecy about someone so unbelievably powerful. Because remember, we're talking about a saga steeped in and inspired in part by mythology here. Makes her sudden strength in the Force quite intriguing as a plot point, and for some viewers this unexpected shakeup is a breath of fresh air. One theory is that the Force quote-unquote chose Rey as a conduit to flow through, and it desires to use her to bring about a change in the tide of the wars. But if this is the case, there's no allusion to it in The Last Jedi. Another theory is that Rey's powers quote-unquote awakened, along with those of a glut of other adepts, due to an imbalance in the Force that occurred after Luke cut off his own Force connection. Even if one of these far-out theories is true, they don't help the character much, because we all know what happens to individuals who are suddenly given large amounts of power, and abilities that they don't even know about. They struggle to control and focus that power, and inevitably cause collateral damage. Luke chalks Rey's proficiency up to, quote-unquote, raw power. Now, I found this a missed opportunity for some great character development. If Rey was suddenly ultimately powerful in the Force, she ought to be feeling overwhelmed, sensing things left and right, and having a hard time shutting out subtle sensory details, or knowing her own strength. Yet, unlike what happens to Anakin and Luke in the prequels and the original trilogy, or even to Finn, Luke, and Poe in The Last Jedi, her actions never lead to negative consequences, and thus, she never really learns anything. "The greatest teacher failure is," Yoda says in this new film, and yet, it is Luke who is constantly and continually failing. In his old age in this Disney canon, Luke's stubborn and stuck in a mire of regrets, waiting to die. On the other hand, Rey, in true Mary Sue fashion, has never failed on screen. She's never experienced being unable to help her friends, or having to choose between their suffering and her own life. The worst that has happened to her is that she's had her mind invaded by Kylo Ren, and she's been force tortured by Snoke, but she immediately rebounds from both, and neither of those actions have any consequences past being beats on a script. The biggest struggle Rey faces is in coming to terms with the fact that her parents basically abandoned her. Or at least that's what the film leads us to believe. There's maddeningly no conclusive evidence to prove that Kylo Ren wasn't lying. Rey is curious about the dark place on the island, the hole that leads her into a hall of mirrors, where she's mentally trapped into just going through the motions of endless instances of herself. And at the end of this trial, she asks to see her parents, only instead of seeing them, she's confronted with her own face. The vaguely defined trial seems to be telling her that there are no easy answers, and that she will have to shape her own destiny. Now, Rian Johnson actually explained in an interview with Sci-Fi that Rey descends down into there and has to see, just like Luke did in the cave, her greatest fear. And her greatest fear is that, in the search for identity, she has nobody but herself to rely on. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, being attached to the idea of one's parentage is an outward symptom of a deeper inner lack. In Rey's case, she's simply utterly confused as to what to do with all of her newfound power, and thinks that finding her parents will be the key to unlocking her path. This is also why she implores Luke for guidance. But in terms of an inner journey, this is a blatant cop-out. Her inability to reconcile her path isn't a real character failing or inner demon. It's a reality to be lived through, not a flaw to overcome and transcend. Thanks to this lack of specific inner conflict, Rey is a cipher, a bland character with less development than an underwritten shonen anime protagonist. And even worse, over the course of episodes 7 and 8, she has been dragged along by the needs of the plot, rather than being an active force of change within it. Chalk it up to bad planning. It's in part because there is no unified vision between Abrams' The Force Awakens and Johnson's The Last Jedi that the latter is so unsatisfying. The first film sets up a bunch of difficult questions and leads the plot momentum towards a certain direction, and the second one gleefully subverts all that in the name of letting the past die, one of the film's central themes. It's all well and good to want to wrap up loose ends and go for gotcha moments to shake things up, but this film does them at the expense of the overarching plot, character development, and thematic content, and instead injects meaningless bits of pithy humor and preachy quote-unquote life lessons. The problem with this approach is once you insult, ignore, and outright disregard the lore of your mythological space fantasy, it won't carry any weight when you need it to. Care to give some examples, you might ask? Well, let me just briefly interrupt myself to take a detour and count the number of unanswered or frankly unbelievable character-driven questions posed by the film. Basic issues with The Last Jedi that the Disney canon can't explain. How come Luke Skywalker, upon learning that Kylo Ren killed Han and the First Order destroyed the New Republic with a star-sucking ultra weapon, did not immediately decide to go to Leia to help her? Fear? Shame? Even with the Starkiller base destroyed, she was clearly in mortal danger, with a sudden power vacuum and the First Order on the rampage. If Luke is already willing to die alone on Ahch-To, doesn't that mean that he has nothing left to live for? And if that's the case, wouldn't he seize any opportunity to redeem himself by dealing with a problem that he feels he created? To just sit around and mope about his past failures does not fit with his established character. It is a sign of a man who no longer values life, who in fact is anti-life, and doesn't care if his sister lives or dies. I can't accept this. One might argue that Luke was afraid that Kylo Ren or Snoke might turn him to the dark side, but there was no evidence of that in this film. Did Rey even have a plan when she went to see Luke? Was this not something discussed by the Resistance? Was she just going to stubbornly wait there forever? There was really no plan B for if he refused to come back. I had an issue with how R2 had a map to the First Jedi Temple. This was not explained in either of the films, but apparently he had tapped into the first Death Star and downloaded a whole bunch of their archives. And he was able to sort of piece together some of the locations as to where Ahch-To was or something like that. Not really important, but that is a plot hole. If you're just looking at the films, it is a plot hole as to how he got that information. Because Luke obviously did not leave it there, did not want to be found. By what reasoning would Luke have not read the ancient Jedi texts as he insinuates to Master Yoda? Laziness? Impossible. He knew that he carried the entire future of the Jedi with him. It was his absolute duty to read and digest them and apply them to his teachings. Arguing otherwise is tantamount to believing that Luke does not care about life itself, humanity, or the Force, which is patently untrue and impossible. He shut himself away out of fear and shame, and cracks jokes with R2 and Rey, which means he can still feel something. Just why is Kylo Ren so innately evil? How did he possibly end up with so much darkness within him? This film seems to insist that he was born that way, which blatantly goes against episodes 1 to 6's established themes of nurture over nature in terms of human development. There's always a reason for why one turns to the light side or to the dark. It may be true that Snoke did some terrible things to mess with Kylo Ren and gave him some sort of brain damage while he was in Leia's womb, but this is never mentioned in the films. Leia and Han seemed at a loss as to why their son was evil, and Ben himself can provide little insight. Allow me to quote the film. Rey, why did you hate your father? Give me an honest answer. You had a father who loved you, who gave a damn about you. Kylo Ren, I didn't hate him. Then why? Why what? Why what? Say it. Why did you kill him? I don't understand. No. Your parents threw you away like garbage. They didn't. They did. But you can't stop needing them. It's your greatest weakness. Looking for them in everyone. In Han Solo. Now in Skywalker. So from this exchange, I'm led to believe that Kylo Ren never hated Han, but rather saw his own attachment to his father as a weakness that he needed to eradicate. Well, that just plain doesn't make sense. Attachment is supposed to lead to the emotions that empower dark side adepts. He should be attached to his hatred for his dad, or attached to an idea of his dad that he needs to destroy. It's not a lack of attachment. A lack of attachment is a good thing. Okay? If a character is as evil and twisted but also as conflicted as Kylo, we deserve to see more of what made him that way. In the films, we don't have any background as to how Ben encountered Snoke. In fact, we don't have any background regarding Snoke whatsoever, how he became so powerful in the ways of the Force, and how he managed to step up to command the First Order. These are basic questions that were posed by The Force Awakens, and there's no blaming the fans if we expect answers. Defenders of this sequel trilogy may point out that in the original trilogy, we were given no information about the Emperor, but we didn't require it then. Palpatine was accepted as part of the world building, and his mystery was interesting. But once you make a sequel to that story, one that's supposed to take place in that same universe, but introduces a ridiculously powerful alien character that has arrived out of left field to break the peace established in Return of the Jedi, seize the single most powerful position in the galaxy, and drive Han Solo's own son to kill him, you most definitely owe the audience an explanation as to where he came from, or at least what his motivation or endgame is, otherwise there's no weight to his death. But this film even wastes Andy Serkis's talents. I did love the Hugh Hefner gold bathrobe though, gotta say that was pretty cool. Anyway, speaking of endgames and power, I'd like to point out that even if we don't know what made him so evil, and he comes off more often than not as an indecisive man-child with no leadership qualities, Kylo Ren was one of the best written, developed, and acted characters in this film, though that really isn't saying much. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's look a bit closer at what Rian Johnson, Disney, and Kathleen Kennedy have done to Luke Skywalker. The character Assassination of Luke Skywalker by Disney, Kathleen Kennedy, Rian Johnson, and J.J. Abrams. Suffice it to say that the Luke Skywalker that greets us in The Last Jedi is a complete, point-by-point subversion of the depiction of his character in the original trilogy. He's a grumpy, miserable, failed man who was unwilling to even talk to Rey. By making her knock and wait at Luke's doorstep, Johnson surely thinks that he is making some parallel to the Zen masters who would constantly reject their students as a way of testing them before training them. But in this instance, it comes off as untimely and ridiculous. Set aside for the moment the question of whether the Jedi should continue or not. The question of Rey's training or of ending the Order outright could come later. The Luke of the past films would not have hesitated upon hearing of the events of the last film to do the right thing, to quote-unquote man up, raise his X-Wing out of the water, and, even if he couldn't save Kylo Ren, to at least attempt to protect Leia's life and the lives of innocents after his nephew killed Han in cold blood. That this Luke is conflicted about training Rey makes sense, but why is training even the central question? Best to first give her the full picture. and this should be easy if he's already resigned to dying alone. It should be clear from her own spunk and drive that unless he gives her the whole story, whatever rhetoric he spins to dismiss her isn't going to be able to convince her why the Jedi must end, or that the Force, light or dark, is dangerous. And yet, he dawdles on and avoids that too. It's maddening how this bastardized Luke is content to roll over and do nothing. The slaughter of his students ought to have spurred any man, let alone one who has already gone through so much hardship and sacrificed so much, to deal with a problem he had a part in creating, rather than wallowing in self-pity over it, all the while knowing that he is the only person with the power and the adeptness in the Force who could possibly do something about Kylo Ren. The fate of the galaxy is at stake due to Luke's own major mistake, and he knows that he could have prevented the death of his best friend, but for most of the film, Luke doesn't seem the least bit troubled over it. This is why the film cut away from showing Luke's reaction to Han's death, because they couldn't make what ought to have been genuine grief work with how he continues to mope around for another hour and a half of screen time. He lies to Rey, denies the truth, and it's only when Rey physically attacks him and defeats him, which I'm also calling bullshit on, does he relent. And the truth, we're told that Luke snuck up to his nephew's bedside, read the evil that was in his heart, and thought for a second that he ought to just kill him. Then that second passed and Kylo Ren ended up with the wrong idea. First off, that Luke changed his mind so quickly shouldn't excuse the fact that as his first thought, he instinctively went towards killing Ben in cold blood. What manner of evil could have been in this child's mind to make him so sure that was the only way to go? Surely it wasn't evil enough, because most of Kylo's hatred is self-directed, as evidenced by his tantrums, drive to cut off all attachments, and constant disappointment in himself. Not to mention, he still has qualms about killing the members of his own family. He couldn't open fire upon his own mother. Now there's people here on Earth who would gladly kill their mothers. Are they any worse than the mass murderer known as Darth Vader, whom Luke unconditionally forgave and believed in, even though he betrayed the Jedi Order, slew every youngling in the Jedi Temple, and spent years hunting down Jedi in exile and ruling the galaxy with an iron fist? Just what did Luke see exactly? It just doesn't add up in my opinion. Taken all together, these are worse than the actions of a beaten and downtrodden character who saw all of his students massacred and his dreams up in smoke. They are the actions of a deranged psychopath. Let us be as specific as possible. We are not just talking about on-screen actions. It is the context within which the film presents Luke Skywalker that is immensely troubling, rings absolutely hollow for the character, and retroactively damages the past work. Let's diverge from the films for a second and take a very recent example. In the campaign of the new, Disney canon Star Wars Battlefront 2, Luke Skywalker is noble and heroic. He goes out of his way to save an Inferno squad member's life. This character inspires his squad mates to turn against the Empire. In this game, Luke is portrayed as being heroic and compassionate. All that heroism, selflessness, and wisdom came at a hefty price. Unlike saintly Rey, Luke had to earn every last bit of his street cred. To overcome his inner faults and open himself up to the Force, Luke trained with Obi-Wan, then with Yoda, and, as every other work has led us to believe for many years after Yoda's death, he was not the kind of man who would stop improving or studying the Force. He was not the kind of man who would stammer and try to evade his teacher's question when asked if he had read the ancient Jedi texts. No matter how broken he might have been by the loss of his students to an inexplicably evil boy, whom he also inexplicably almost murdered in his sleep. To buy into the reality of this film is to accept so many implausible scenarios, it made my head spin and reject what I was seeing outright. If you'd like to go even further into hypothetical scenarios, follow me down this train of thought. Luke, who's not only naturally strong in the Force, but trained for many years in it, ought to have sensed the darkness within Ben Solo at a young age. Like any great Zen monk, he then ought to have taken immediate remedial steps to show Ben love and compassion and lead him down the correct path. If Luke did not sense this darkness, if it was hidden to him all that time, then either Snoke was actively hiding it from him and Force-sensitive Leia somehow at every second of young Ben's life, or Ben was born so sneaky and devious that he could have fooled a Jedi Master as to his true nature as an infant. Neither option seems to make sense to me. Let me add to that. It's possible that Ben suddenly turned evil. This is an important moment to show. This would explain a lot of things. This, you know, there's no way that he went from good kid to I'm going to kill my dad. All right, like, we have to sort of see that progression. We have to see what spurred it on. We have to see why. We have to see what seed there was in Ben that sort of hatred sprung out of. Why does he have that self-hatred? You know, it's so unclear. It's so unclear. He doesn't hate his father, so he accepts him and his faults. Okay. He clearly doesn't hate Leia, or else he would have killed her. It just, none of this adds up. Are you starting to see the mental gymnastics it takes to consider even just the primary characters and events of the Last Jedi canon? Defenders of the sequel trilogy have been making the fallacious argument that Luke's character needed to be severely weakened in order to empower Rey and Ben. But there are so many other ways they could have put Luke in a disadvantaged position, or made him unable to take things into his own hands. Luke could have been fighting a battle against the dark side of the Force within himself. He could have been hunted down like Obi-Wan and Yoda, while having dependents whom he needed to protect and keep secret, much like himself when he was younger. He might have been studying or meditating in an attempt to find a solution to the constant imbalances in the Force and in how he went wrong in training Ben. Instead, not only do we have a Luke who is unwilling to engage in the world, this film goes out of its way to degrade and belittle him. This film didn't just jump the shark or nuke the fridge, it milked the space anteater mermaid cow. Just take a quick look at some of the fan theories that were made, and you're sure to have seen a whole mess of ideas that would have been far better and more intriguing than what we were given. And with 40 years of prior material, Disney didn't even need to look far. The Lucas-sanctioned expanded universe had no shortage of great and poetic storytelling ideas. The more I think about it, the more baffling it is that Kathleen Kennedy would go so far as to erase the strong and complex Mara Jade from canon in order to push the bland Rey. I haven't even brought up the two other subplots and myriad plot holes that populate this messy film, and how none of the three parallel scenarios are connected to one another at all, thematically or story-wise, but for the loosest strings. But since we're on the topic, let's have a few nitpicks, shall we? So, let me get this straight. Supreme Leader Hugh Snoke, can remotely force choke people, read every thought in Kylo Ren's mind, and use Force lightning. And he was even described by Disney as being stronger than Darth Sidious. But he literally couldn't sense the movement of the lightsaber right beside him. Why did he even have to close his eyes to see Kylo Ren's thoughts? Why did it take seconds after Snoke is killed for the two guards by his side to react, and why was their reaction so slow and lifeless? As to whether the Force can be used to survive, let alone move in the vacuum of space as per Leia's return, I'll leave that to the astrophysicists and those deeper steeped in the lore. It makes my head hurt just considering it. Also, how come that room was able to depressurize within the span of like half a second? Alright, we don't see the other door closing, but you do see the, you do see kind of the air sort of, right before the door opens. There's no way it depressurized that quickly, alright? That would just probably blow her brains out. I'm assuming that other door closed. You know, the door that she entered from. Also, if you watch the Praetorian Guard fight again, you'll see that the choreography isn't really all there. And there's a lot of instances where the guards are just like swinging at the sabers instead of going for obvious weak spots. There's a point where Kylo Ren's saber is in the ground and they swing for the saber. Like, alright, his saber's in the ground, you're gonna swing for the saber? Like, just swing for his head or something, you know? They don't properly team up against the two of them. There's that moment where Rey is like, being pulled in by that one guard. How come there's no other guard there to sort of attack her from behind? Why didn't she just turn off the lightsaber or something? Silly. It's just silly. You're trying to apply sort of medieval combat and physics to essentially what are space laser swords. It doesn't really work. I felt that scene was actually kind of lazy on repeat. Poe Dameron and Admiral Holdo's arc is utterly useless and simply the result of bad management and miscommunication. All Holdo had to do was tell him, yes, there is a plan, and it is Leia's plan, but I can't trust anyone right now, especially after your hotshot stunt, and the fact that we don't know how they tracked us through lightspeed. Subplot solved, unpredictable hotshot put on ice. Well, let's add to that the fact that it's kind of silly to not trust Poe Dameron, simply because he's the one who kind of blew up Starkiller Base. Like, if he was an agent of the First Order, if he was a spy, don't you think he wouldn't have blown up Starkiller Base? Don't you think he wouldn't have even gone after the Dreadnought in the first place? I mean, the whole distrust of him hinges on the fact that she thinks he's a spy. Like, why couldn't she just tell him, all right, here's the plan, let's just keep it under wraps. This is on a need-to-know basis. There's just a complete lack of good management and communication within the Rebels. And you could say that that is a thematic point that the director is trying to make, but it was not executed well. It was not executed well. You can't argue that. The whole conceit of the Resistance running out of fuel is something I'll have to concede as relating to the functioning of their equipment. But one thing that doesn't make sense is how quickly they run out of fuel. And why, for instance, the medical frigate slows down after it runs out of power, seeing as how there's no inertia in space, and any object set in motion should continue at the same velocity until acted upon by another force. We're not talking about naval ships here, okay? We're talking about spaceships in the vacuum of space. Leia's like, oh, let's increase our speed to get away from the First Order ships. All right. They increase their speed. How come the ships are like pretty much at the same distance behind them the whole time? If the First Order is going at maximum speed, and if the Resistance have increased their speed, the gulf between them should be like widening over an 18-hour period. There's so much about this that just sort of strains credulity. We've never seen this level of ineptitude in a pursuit in Star Wars. You have to make up a whole bunch of dumb lore crap to make the whole space plot work. Not to mention the bombers in this film are just a terrible, terrible design. Why would you... Okay, if your bombing fleet is that vulnerable, why wouldn't they be shielded? How come the debris took them out so easily? How come you positioned these bombers so close together? Why didn't you release them in waves? 2 bombers at a time or something. 1 at a time. Why are they so slow? How come there's no escorts for them? Why couldn't you use Y-wings or B-wings? Why couldn't you have like remotely controlled some sort of bomb to go onto the Dreadnought? Why did it have to be dropped from above like a World War II ship? If they're targeted with certain plates and electromagnetic, couldn't you have a ship fly by quickly and then drop them? And then they have an electromagnetic guidance system or something, right? That takes them onto the Dreadnought. Why did the ships have to be hovering right above the Dreadnought in the most vulnerable spot? And it strains credulity to think that bomber was just sitting atop the Dreadnought, with Paige in it, and it wasn't shot down quickly. None of that makes sense. They milked that scene for so long. How about the fact that when Kylo Ren flies into the Rebel hangar, there's no shields in the docking bay. Do you remember in Episode 3 when Obi-Wan and Anakin shut down the shields just to get into the docking bay in General Grievous' ship? Now, you see, there's a progression in these films. In Episode 1, Anakin was able to fly into the droid control ship and blow it up. So, after that, they were like, oh, well, someone can do that. That's why they started having the shields there. If anyone could have just flown into the docking bay of any of these spaceships and blown them up, why isn't it something that's been done over and over again? We're just talking, like, levels of extreme stupidity here, in terms of, you've got to get me to accept so many, because this, because that, because this, because that. In order for this film to make sense, you have to reject so much of what has been previously established in the Star Wars universe. that it's just not even Star Wars anymore. I'm sorry. It's not. It's not even a fan fiction. Fan fiction are better written than this, because those people actually understand the lore. Also, why did Admiral Holdo wait until several other transports were blasted before ramming that pursuing First Order ship? Earlier, it's blatantly stated that that was the plan, but they made it out to be a spur-of-the-moment sacrifice. And why didn't the ramming at lightspeed end that whole fleet? Even accounting for any manner of shields, that much speed and force should have done much more than cutting a large hole in Snoke's flagship. The shockwave and debris alone ought to have wiped out the entire fleet. I've linked a Wikipedia article on here that offers more information on the relativistic kill vehicle trope often seen in science fiction. Here's a quote from that article. A 1 kilogram mass traveling at 99% the speed of light would have a kinetic energy of 5.7 times 10 to the 17th power joules. In explosive terms, it would be equal to 132 megatons of TNT, or approximately 75 megatons more than the yield of Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated. 1 kilogram of mass energy is 8.999 times 10 to the 16th joules, or about 21.5 megatons of TNT. Even worse, what Holdo did introduces a gigantic plot hole across the saga. Why even have dogfights anymore, if all it takes to destroy the largest ships or even space stations are lightspeed kamikaze attacks? Could it truly be that this is the first time in the Star Wars universe anyone has thought of using that as a battle tactic? I mean, hyperspace was previously established in the now non-canon Legends universe as being in another dimension. So, they've thrown that out the window too. And basically, so if anything is in your way when you're, going into hyperspace, you're going to ram into it? No. I mean, that really shouldn't be the case. I'm sorry, but it's utterly silly to me. Moving on. Oh, and Finn and Rose's storyline went absolutely nowhere. Benicio del Toro's character might have been interesting if that arc had even the slightest bearing on the main plot. Captain Phasma was wasted. BB-8 is made out to be capable of doing almost anything. He can tie up guards, board and pilot a walker, fly Finn and Rose into the base, etc. It's absolutely insulting to the First Order and to the audience's intelligence how much this little droid is able to get away with. The Resistance should build an army of BB-8s and let them take down the First Order. Why are there no TIE interceptors or bombers, who ought to have been deployed against the Resistance ships, or other small fighter craft? Are the wasteful fools that run the First Order just down to regular old TIE fighters now? On that note, how does the First Order continue to get its funding? By bullying other systems and running a protection racket? They lost so much of their stormtroopers, ships, and even their entire planet-sized base at the end of The Force Awakens. But there is no evidence of that having hurt them here, at least not enough for them to take pause and regroup. With these two military powers at each other's throats, how come no other force in the galaxy has stepped in to fill the power vacuum, to pick a side and assist one or the other, or to challenge either the First Order or Resistance? Don't the highest-ranking officers of the First Order have better things to do than chase the Resistance for days at a time? Couldn't they have had another fleet warp in to the other side of the fleeing Resistance and catch them in a pincer attack? How does the First Order maintain control of so much of the galaxy with such a comparatively small force and with such little support, especially now that they lost their strongest weapon and everyone knows they blew up the New Republic? Is there literally no one left to care? What's happening on Coruscant right now? Does the Senate even exist anymore? And no, it wasn't that planet that blew up in The Force Awakens that was Hosnian Prime. It's like these films are happening in a large cosmic vacuum. Why doesn't the film even attempt to answer these questions? Just the slightest bit of context and world building would be helpful. Oh, and how about the Knights of Ren? Wait to build up a series of cool-looking characters and then discard them completely. Here's another complaint that was brought up to me. How come Kylo Ren doesn't sense that Luke was just force projecting himself? He ought to have been able to sense Luke's presence or lack thereof. He should also have been able to recognize that the lightsaber that Luke was using was the same one that he and Rey had just blown up, probably just a couple of hours before that. It was pointed out to me that Leia seemed to have noticed that Luke wasn't really there, so why should Kylo Ren, who's presumably powerful enough in the Force to stop a laser blast in midair the first time we see him, not be able to tell that he wasn't actually fighting Luke? Answer me that, please. One observation I read in a comment section was that The Last Jedi plays and feels like a Netflix film. I would have to agree. It's mostly clinical, only artful when it absolutely needs to be, and largely written, shot, and edited like a Marvel film. Every serious moment is undercut with a cheap joke, and for over half of the film's runtime it's blandly lit and composed. Where Gareth Edwards took pains to make Rogue One, though shot digitally, gel visually with the style of the original trilogy, and even J.J. Abrams attempted to add some flair, and lens flares, to spice up his shot compositions. The Last Jedi feels boring and digital in its aesthetic, mise-en-scène, sets, and lighting setups, despite being shot on 35mm. It's like for about 60% of the film, the filmmakers went out of their way to make it look and flow as blandly as possible, only to sort of crank it up a little towards the end. But hey, at least John Williams' score is better this time around. Not nearly as good as the prequel score, but it's better than the Force Awakens score, which was pretty rushed. Why the Disney canon will never eclipse George Lucas's vision.
Well, it's based on human behavior, human psychology, mythology, which is the sort of archaeology of human behavior and thinking. And since it has those motifs, it is very universal, and everybody can relate to it.
Yes,
it's about good and evil in us, as well as our institutions. Mm-hmm. So, and the idea that some of us think we're really great people, but in the real world we're not. We're terrible people.
Or you can make bad choices.
Well, you make bad choices, but you run your life in a very selfish way, and you think you're doing good when you're actually not. And at the same time, it's how do democracies turn back into dictatorships? Why do people who have the power to have the freedom and everything turn it over to somebody who's going to take it all away from them? It's happened through history forever and ever, and all Star Wars is a way of updating that idea to say, watch out, because there are people out there who don't play by the rules, and if you're not careful, you're going to lose all your freedom. And at the same time, those people who may not play by the rules because they're selfish and greedy turn themselves into evil people who don't care about other people.
So far, fan reaction to The Last Jedi has been decidedly mixed. The film goes out of its way to preach direct messages to the audience, with one of the main ones being spoken outright by Kylo Ren. It's time to let old things die. Snoke, Skywalker, the Sith, the Jedi, the Rebels. Let it all die. What's clear to me, from the honestly disturbing scene of Yoda setting fire to the Jedi tree and giggling about it, is that director Rian Johnson's priority was in destroying, not deconstructing, destroying the legacy and consequences of every Star Wars film that came before his. And he threw out the baby with the bathwater. This is an act of monumental ego on the part of a filmmaker whose previous work I loved, by the way, who has shown that he doesn't even grasp the finer details of Mr. Lucas's mythology. Case in point, let's take perhaps the film's most important scene. Luke is coming clean to Rey on the truth regarding Kylo Ren. Luke, Lesson 2. Now that they're extinct, the Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is a failure, hypocrisy, hubris. Rey, that's not true. Luke, at the height of their powers, the Jedi allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. Amazing, Luke. Every word of what you just said was wrong. During the events of the prequel trilogy, the Jedi weren't at the height of their powers at all, and to say so is insulting to anyone who knows anything about Star Wars, or to anyone who has played the Knights of the Old Republic games. The tide was shifting and the Jedi were growing weaker. Master Yoda admitted that he could no longer sense as clearly as he used to, which is why no one predicted the rise of Darth Sidious. This outright lie, written by Johnson and told by Luke to an impressionable Rey, goes against the clearly established lore in the prequels, not to mention numerous other non-film sources that make it clear that Jedi were in decline around the time of the Battle of Naboo. And before anyone claims that Mr. Lucas and Mr. Hamill are 100% alright with these deeply flawed sequel films, please consider that Mr. Lucas can't speak as freely as he would like. Recall the apology he made after the Charlie Rose interview.
they looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. So I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. You know, it started here and it went there. And it's all about generations, and it's about, you know, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera. I mean, ultimately. I mean, we call it space opera, but people don't realize it's actually a soap opera. And it's all about family problems and that. It's not about spaceships. And these are my kids. So
all those Star Wars films.
All the Star Wars films.
They were your kids.
Yeah, well, they are. Right. You know, I loved them. I created them. I'm very intimately involved in them, and obviously to
and
sell
you
them
sold
off,
them.
I sold them to the white slavers that take these things and.
Okay, but having said all that, and having talked to you for the last, and known you for a while, and admired you, I mean, it must hurt you.
Well,
it's your family. It's the last story. It's your story.
But
it's
in the end,
you.
But I knew there's 3 more stories, and I knew that was going to probably take, you know, to do it right would take about 10 years. And I said, I'm 70. I don't know whether I'll be here when I'm 80. You know, every 10 years the odds get less. And so I said, and I'm not ready to do that because I want to do these other things. So I have to make the decision on my own that it's time for me to move on.
And that he has a vested interest in these films' success since he owns billions of dollars in Disney stock. As such, it is up to us fans to hold Disney accountable for their treatment of Star Wars. And to this end, I am officially boycotting all further output from Disney, including Marvel, Pixar, anything. I've only read a few of the Legacy and Extended Universe books, and a long time ago. But I will only consider those stories to be canon now. And I'll be starting with the Heir to the Empire trilogy and sort of working my way back from there. Replaying the Knights of the Old Republic games, you know, all that jazz. The expanded universe content, it's not perfect, but their stories and characters are far more interesting than what Disney has come up with. The expanded universe is, let's say, probably like 80-90% of all Star Wars content. You know, the films, the Clone Wars cartoons, those are great and all, but they only tell a little bit of the picture. There's a lot of journalists out there who are saying that Star Wars was a dead franchise. I don't know who pays these journalists, but it's far from dead. And anybody who knows anything about the expanded universe content knows that there's just a wealth of ideas out there. Star Wars is anything from dead, but this film killed it. All right, it killed it. It was healthy, it was alive, it was happy, the fan base was loving the Clone Wars show. Then Disney comes and just guts the show, right? Sticks a knife into the stomach of the fan base, twists that knife, right? And then is telling everybody else, hey guys, Star Wars was dead. We found it and it was dead. You know, I mean, it's not dead. It never died. Star Wars is like one of the most lucrative and beloved intellectual properties in the world. I don't see how you can just you kill something and then say it was already dead and expect people to believe that. That is the definition of hubris right there. If I'm disagreeing with fundamental story or character decisions, it is because I believe The Last Jedi is blatantly disrespectful to everything previously established in the Star Wars canon. Disney has drawn a clear line in the sand and rejected so many of the fundamental building blocks and story and character choices that made Star Wars great that this film, and whatever follows next from it, can hardly even be called Star Wars at all. No. The Last Jedi is not a deconstruction of Star Wars, as some of its defenders might have you believe. It is the anti-Star Wars, a blatant destruction and desecration of the foundation of the series from the ground up. It derives its power from the shock value of going against the grain of what this series has always been about, and of eliminating any iota of courage or heroism in Luke Skywalker, only giving us the bare modicum of a redemption arc by having him commit a courageous sacrifice in the final act, and only after nearly all of the resistance has been picked off like flies. Over the last 3 decades, Disney films have pushed anti-traditional stances. Heroes and heroines alike outright reject traditions and authority and seek their own paths. I'm not saying that traditions are good by default or should not be questioned, but life isn't so black and white. George Lucas knew that, And that's why the original 6 Star Wars films, through the journeys of Anakin and Luke and the struggles of their friends, are filled with a nuanced exploration of these questions, of imperfect political ideologies in troubling times, of allowing old dogma to fade away and change, and of adaptation between times of great war and peace. All through characters that, even if they are lightly sketched, have clear ideological stances that are explored through their words and actions. This is world building. Han had many chances to save his own hide, but Luke inspired him and he couldn't turn his back on the rebellion. A reformed gambler, Lando, had to make a difficult choice between his duties to Cloud City and to his good friend. Leia risked life and limb to go into Jabba's palace and pull off a daring trick with a thermal detonator to rescue Han. Obi-Wan had to finally accept that he had failed Anakin and face him in mortal combat, and yet, when the opportunity came to kill him, he couldn't do it. Padme wanted to do her best for her people in a messed up system, and through her disillusionment, we saw how the political process was rigged. Even a minor character like Jango Fett just thought of himself as a man trying to make his way in the universe, and even showing that he had the ego to want an unmodified clone to raise as a son was enough to sketch out his character to a certain extent. Then there's the Darth Jar Jar theory, but, let's not get into that. Every character in the original Star Wars trilogy, and most of the characters in the prequels, were all heroes of their own stories. I mean, you don't think that Bail Organa was the hero of his own story? He represented something. He stood for something. Not to mention, here's another point you don't really see addressed. At the ending of Return of the Jedi, Luke looks and he sees the 3 Force ghosts of Yoda, Anakin, and Obi-Wan. And the implication is that he, going forward, is going to be able to draw on their past knowledge and experiences. They're going to help him. He's not going to be alone in bringing the Jedi back. Not to mention the dogmatic traditions that had taken place are no longer, enforced. There's no longer any power structure for that. So you don't have the old Jedi Order. You don't have the whole celibacy thing, which was a big deal in the expanded universe. So there is a synthesis, okay? There's bringing the old and the new together and sort of forging a different way, different path. Now, having a synthesis of those things is very different from what they did in The Last Jedi, which is for Luke to just say, you know what, F it all, screw it all, we don't need any of this. To say that we need the light side is vanity. Now, that does not properly take into account the flip side of that, which is, okay, so if we let the light side die out, the dark side will die out? No, because according to the film's own logic, after Luke had closed off his sort of connection to the Force, or after Kylo had grown in strength, Rey was able to rise up. So just shutting themselves away from the light side of the Force or just running away isn't going to change anything. So what appears to be wisdom from Luke is really just cowardice. Because how is running away going to stop the First Order? Someone else would just pop up like Rey and just have amazing Force powers again. This is the logic that the film wants us to follow, by the way. This isn't my logic. Basically, if what Luke said offered a sort of solution to the Kylo Ren problem, meaning that, like, if we Jedi sort of drop out, of the whole picture, then the dark side of the Force will fade away, that doesn't follow from the film's logic. So this is just terrible storytelling. This is a quote from George Lucas, from The Science of Star Wars. Most of the spiritual reality in the movies is based on a synthesis of all religions, a synthesis through history, the way man has perceived the unknown and the great mystery and tried to deal with that or dealing with it. George Lucas drew from many, many influences in making Star Wars. Joseph Campbell, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, old school sci-fi, Akira Kurosawa, Taoism, Zen Buddhism, Arthurian legends, Dune, Robert Heinlein, film noir, 1930s Saturday matinee serials, you name it. His prequel films were so filled with ideas they burst at the seams, and many would argue that they fell apart under their own weight, thanks to sometimes weak script decisions, an overabundance of CGI, and theatrical direction. I'm not going to say bad acting because the bad acting resulted from the theatrical direction. But at least they reached for the stars and attempted to tell deeply human stories about flawed characters without destroying the characters and impact of the original trilogy or going against its themes. On the other hand, what have Disney used as primary sources for their version of Star Wars? The original trilogy and possibly Spaceballs. Rather than follow the usual Star Wars pattern of the Campbellian monomyth, the film is a regression for Luke. It takes him back to before he was in the first Star Wars even, and then grounds him in the refusal of the call stage for nearly the entire runtime. I am shocked that seemingly no one involved at the highest levels of the production of this sequel trilogy has been able to grasp their hubris in attempting to replicate the tone, storyline, and script beats of the original trilogy without properly understanding what made it work in the first place. The marrow of the skeleton of Star Wars is in its humanist message and in the transformative power of hope. Disney has attempted to harness the pale word hope in all three of their films so far, and each time it has fallen flat because they don't appreciate the finer details of world building, or writing spiritually deep characters, or integrating character development with a plot. Nor do they care about properly implementing mythic structure and storytelling devices in their films. They just want to keep the kids and non-English speakers entertained. Some say it's all about the quick buck and the international box office. Others say it's desperation to make up in ticket sales what they aren't making in merchandise or home video anymore. Some may even claim that it's all propaganda. But Disney's Star Wars directors, if they don't wish to be fired, must also meet the requisite quota of one-liners, pick which demographics to appeal to in what quantities, and balance the ratio of cute mascots to action to drama. From the audience's chair, though, the constant balancing act gets old and predictable, and the meat of the story gets lost in the static of mediocre filler content. The amount of pointless filler in this film is simply staggering, especially considering that we're talking about a product that must have cost upwards of $250 million, probably even more, to make. Even so, the worst transgressions are against the cast and characters of the original trilogy. By utterly emasculating the character of Luke Skywalker beyond all reason, all Disney has done is break the hearts of millions of fans for the sake of being edgy and different. Is it any wonder that the law of diminishing returns has already kicked into high gear after only 3 movies in 3 years? I am done with the Disney canon, but this is my advice to the Mouse House. First off, finish this sequel trilogy right. Give Rey some actual stakes in character development. Don't split up the characters. The constant cross-cutting between storylines in this film got old fast. Also, don't shy away from emotional payoff. How come we never saw Luke's reaction to Han's death? That was a major oversight. Second, if you're not even going to attempt to tell a proper mythological story, just stick to what you know. Make crowd-pleasing Marvel-esque films with the Star Wars license if you like. Just set them on the other side of the galaxy and in a timeline far, far away from what has already been established. Don't attempt to tell stories about Jedi or the Force or the Skywalkers anymore, not without the input of someone who actually understands mythology, spirituality, and story structure at a deep level. You failed utterly in doing justice to these immortal characters, and The Last Jedi not only damages the legacy of the entire Star Wars saga, it's clearly alienated a good segment of your fan base. Now, this is what I would do if I were you, Disney. Go get Timothy Zahn. Alright, get him and Lawrence Kasdan. Get them together in a room. Get them to crank out and really think about what to do. And hopefully you're not going to touch something that you can't do justice to. Because otherwise you're just diluting and degrading. You know what? Why am I giving you advice? You suck. You ruined it. You killed Star Wars. Alright? Anyway, I really wish Carrie Fisher had a better swan song than this. But the person I'm most sorry for in all this is Mark Hamill, who, by the way, turned in a great performance, even though he didn't agree with the direction Lucasfilm wanted to take his character. Mr. Hamill said this to director Rian Johnson after reading the script for Episode 8. I fundamentally disagree with virtually everything you've decided for my character. I'm really sorry you had to suffer through this, Mr. Hamill. You're a great guy, and you deserved so much better. I don't know how many more videos I'll be making, because I just don't make that many videos in general. But I just really wanted to put this out there in the world and sort of support the section of fandom that is pushing back against Disney for what they've done. And I truly believe that what Disney has done to Star Wars is mean-spirited. It was done out of malice and spite and absolute disregard for the fan base that has been the lifeblood of Star Wars and kept it alive for so long. And now they're asking us to not only to accept this, but to be happy for it. So I can't stand seeing people be called sexist or racist or too dumb to understand subtlety for disliking a badly made movie. And this is a badly made movie. It's badly written. It's pretty. If you like CGI and cool sort of moving camera shots, and if you like to see nice outdoor shots. Anyway, just I'm calling for boycotts. That's basically where I'm at right now. I'm calling for absolute boycotts, not just on this film, but anything Star Wars. If you really must see a Star Wars film, don't pay for a different film. If you like this film, more power to you. I'm not trying to put you down at all. I can definitely see why people like this film. It tried to do something different, and it tried to subvert expectations. That's what keeps it interesting for a lot of people. It sort of does its own thing, goes in its own direction. But it's not telling a coherent story. It's sacrificing so much, and it's riding on the goodwill, and it just burns away that goodwill that fans have for Star Wars. Like you've just shoved an ice cream cone into an incinerator, right? It just, boom. It's so quickly, this film just burned up all the goodwill that Disney had been building up already for Star Wars. And maybe not just goodwill, but the trust. You know, once you've broken like the trust of a fan base like this, you're not going to get it back. I don't trust Disney with anything anymore. Thank you for listening to me. If you like this video, you can subscribe to me. I don't make that many videos, but this is one I really wanted to put out there. So feel free to share it far and wide if you like. And, you know, remix it, do whatever you want with it. May the Force be with you all, and I'll catch you next time.